Vancouver man wants to open Canada's first crack and heroin store. On January 31, British Columbia will decriminalize personal use quantities of heroin, fentanyl, meth, cocaine, and MDMA. Possessing less than 2.5 grams of those drugs will no longer be illegal. The drugstore, which is the best possible name, with only 3 weeks to go before British Columbia's decriminalization of hard drugs, a Vancouver man says he is already planning to open Canada's first store selling crack, meth, and heroin. Look at all these fucking ads here that I'm... Known as the drugstore, it would be a retail location selling hard drugs in quantities of 2.5 grams per customer. Staff would wear bulletproof vests and face masks, not for COVID safety, but to shroud their identities. Quote, "The drugstore will provide customers with reliable access to safe, tested drugs. Harm reduction supplies such as unused sterile needles, pipes, etc., and educational information," reads a business plan provided to a reporter for Vice News. So once again, real quick, this guy is going to get arrested instantly. They're going to get arrested instantly. Everyone involved with this, as soon as it opens, are going to get arrested pretty much instantly. But they shouldn't. And I want to keep reading this because I 1000% support this plan. And this is 1000% what needs to be done, not just in Canada, but in the United States and every country that has to deal with a pandemic of drug-related deaths. The fentanyl crisis is not actually a crisis of people overdosing on fentanyl. The fentanyl crisis are people dying because of the U.S.'s exported policy of a globalized war on drugs. That is what resulted in the fentanyl crisis. Drugs could be legalized and regulated to ensure maximum possible safety, just like alcohol. When alcohol was illegalized in this country during the Prohibition era, what happened? Two major things happened during Prohibition in the United States that we can learn from. One, Prohibition created the U.S. Mafia. The U.S. Mafia was birthed by Prohibition. Why? Because they were willing to break the law. And they were willing to operate black markets. And they reaped all the rewards and used that financing to engage in illegal criminal activity in this country for decades following. So, just throwing that out there. But, hey, I think the mafia is pretty cool. So let's look at the other reason. Bad batches. A lot of people, referred to as moonshiners, would make alcoholic beverages in their bathtubs, other ways, distilleries that were not regulated, not cleaned, whatever. Oftentimes, ingredients used were not properly handled. It would result in people drinking the product and keeling over. Do you see that nowadays? When's the last time someone's had one sip of moonshine and died? You don't see that. Why? Because the government regulates alcohol production. So once again, the crisis of fentanyl overdoses is not because of fentanyl. It's because people are consuming drugs without knowing what's in them. Now, that's a problem. If you are putting stuff in your body and you have no idea what's in there, you're not going to last long. And so that's why the so-called opioid crisis in this country, the United States, ballooned 3 or 4 times the amount of deaths that we now see in the so-called fentanyl crisis. Why? Because opioids were rightfully stopped giving away like candy. But unfortunately, you can't undo the addiction that many people in this country had. And they turned to harder drugs. And some of them were laced with fentanyl, and then they died. So let's keep going. Not included in the report was where the business's inventory would come from. While Vancouver recently became home to clinics that will prescribe medical-grade opioids to drug users, there was no mention of a similar arrangement for the drugs store. It's all the brainchild of Jerry Martin, a self-proclaimed king of compassion who recently stood trial on charges related to the alleged operation of an illegal cannabis dispensary in Whitewood, Saskatchewan. Martin's dispensary, Martin Medical Services, was raided by the RCMP in 2016, just 2 years before Canada legalized retail sales of recreational cannabis. On January 31, British Columbia will decriminalize personal use quantities of heroin, fentanyl, methamphetamine, cocaine, and MDMA. Starting at the end of the month, possessing less than 2.5 grams of those drugs will no longer be illegal. The criminal status of drugs is a federal responsibility, of course, but British Columbia successfully obtained a 2-year time-limited exemption from the Controlled Drugs and Substances Act. According to the province, the emergency measure is, quote, intended to, quote, reduce the barriers and stigma related to drug addiction in a bid to curb the province's sky-high rates of overdose fatalities. But while personal use possession will now become decriminalized, it will remain just as illegal to sell or traffic any of those drugs. Under this exemption, illegal drugs will not be legalized and will not be sold in stores, states a provincial background document on the policy. Nevertheless, Vancouver has a long history of looking the other way when retail locations start selling illegal drugs over the counter. Before Canada legalized recreational marijuana in 2018, Vancouver was home to more than 3 dozen cannabis dispensaries whose existence was a direct contravention of the Controlled Drugs and Substances Act. But the sector became entrenched for the simple reason that Vancouver police openly refused to bust them. Quote, we do have a priority-based approach to policing here in Vancouver, and we do not have other priorities. And we do have other priorities, which means that's the bottom of their list, and they got more important shit to do. So maybe this drugstore will last a little longer. We'll see. I'm not sure. I don't live in Vancouver, right? So I don't have that information. But if something like that happened here, they'd get fucked pretty fast. Was how Vancouver police spokesperson Brian Montague explained the system at the time. Martin told Vice getting arrested for the drugstore is part of the plan. Should the store be busted, his goal would be to mount a charter challenge against the federal prohibition on hard drugs. Yo, I gotta get this guy on my show. This guy sounds like a fucking hero. If anyone knows this guy, if anyone has a contact, I'd love to bring him on. The case would essentially argue that banning retail sales of hard drugs is a contravention of the charter guaranteed right to life, liberty, and security of person, on the grounds that it causes drug users to seek out illegal sources of drugs which carry a higher overdose risk. It's basically the same challenge Martin had attempted in the case of his Whitewood dispensary. Basically, quote, allowing medical storefront access has been the main goal all along, he told Grasslands News just before going to trial in 2021. In that case, the challenge fizzled out in part due to the federal passage of the Cannabis Act, which rendered many of the case's core arguments moot. But in a recent Facebook case bemoaning the expense and mental strain of the failed challenge, Martin said he was ready to do it all again. Quote, I would risk my freedom all over again and lose everything. Give up everything to change the law so that people can get help medicinally. Again, hero. This guy is a hero. So I guess that's the end of the article. But I want to follow up on this for sure. The drugstore. Once again, I'm 1000% endorsing this. This is something that needs to be done. If someone is addicted to drugs, Do you understand what the word addicted means? For example, about 93% of Americans are addicted to drugs, drug addicts. 93% of Americans are addicted to sugar, which is an ultra-processed, refined, pure drug. It is a hard drug. 93% of Americans are addicted. But if someone is addicted to something, it means that they cannot stop taking it without medical intervention, or at the very least, social intervention, a support group. The idea that drug addicts should be forced, especially when the government, the United States government, of course, this isn't Canada, but the United States government got millions of people addicted to opioids and then said, well, you're on your own. Did those millions of people just quit cold turkey? No. They went to things like heroin and black market pills that, of course, were laced with fentanyl, and that is why people are dying. People are not dying necessarily because of the drugs. Now, a lot of these drugs have severe negative health impacts in the same way that sugar does. I think people should be allowed to put harmful things in their body. I think people should be allowed to try any drug that they want. Just as I think people should be allowed to get help if they want to. And so, of course, drugs need to be legalized and regulated. Fentanyl only exists because of black markets. If you got rid of black markets, you would get rid of fentanyl. No one wants fentanyl. No one needs fentanyl, except for maybe people performing surgeries at the emergency room. So once again, fentanyl only exists because of the war on drugs. The war on drugs, which is one of the United States' most disastrous exports, was started because Richard Nixon hated black people. No joke, look it up. We have to deal with the war on drugs today because some dead racist hated black people. People are getting killed from overdoses of fentanyl right now because Richard Nixon hated black people. Of course, what I'm referring to is Richard Nixon's administration. We're coming up with ways to revoke the right to vote from black people shortly after the Civil Rights and Voting Rights Act were passed in the 1960s. Richard Nixon came along and was like, oh shit, these black people are voting and they're not voting for me. What do we do? Oh, I know. The blacks love weed. Let's just make it illegal and then arrest them all. And the rest was history. And all the other major countries in the world, in Europe, in North America, they followed in the footsteps. Why? Because they were afraid of what the U.S. government would do to them. If they didn't ban drugs, maybe the U.S. would go after them. Maybe it would ruin their geopolitical relationships. So we engage in a worldwide war on drugs that has affected the entire planet, has killed millions of people because Richard Nixon hated black people. So we want to talk about the legacy of racism in this country. We got to talk about the Controlled Substances Act in the United States and how it exported all across the world. So there you go. I got to get this guy on my show.